to present. Dan is an industry principal with in oil and gas with Hexagon.
Thank y'all for having me here. I get to talk about something that's near and dear and passionate to my heart. In my 27 years in the oil and gas field, I often get invited to universities to give a one-day lecture, maybe to a graduate course, to students about the oil and gas industry. And I always start off with this slide. And it's, you got Colonel Drake up there, and you got the first well drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. And I asked the class, I say, what's significant about that? And they scratch around their head, and then finally somebody would say, well, that's when oil started. And I said, yeah, there was a boom. Well, what's unique about that boom? And then I throw up a picture of the Model T, and I say, it actually occurred 50 years before the car came out. So why did they have an oil boom in the U.S. before the automobile was invented? And the answer was around heating oil and lamp oil for people, and they were getting it from the whaling industry. And so when they had that oil boom, it basically put the whaling industry out of business. Oil, in essence, is a green transitional energy source. But the bottom picture to the right is the problem. Yes, it put the whaling industry out of business, but this is Titusville Creek, where it shows the production operations where basically they're contaminating the environment, and the Cinderella story is anything but green. And to this point, I'll tell you a funny story. My grandfather grew up in Van, Texas, which is on top of one of the super major fields in Texas back in the 30s. And he would tell me stories about how they'd see the rig lights flaring in the background, and they would be out there in the evening with pots and pans in the creek, and they would shift out the condensate, and they would actually gather up the condensate and put it into their automobiles. Now, of course, it wasn't refined and didn't fire that well, so you would have cylinders that weren't firing, and the cars would knock around. And that's why regionally they called it knock gas. So that just exemplifies the problems they had, yes. And right now we find ourselves with natural gas on the precipice of another energy change, and it's a green transitional energy source as well. The U.S. right now is probably one of the cheapest places on the planet to make plastics. And that's because we're sitting on one of the largest reserves for natural gas, and that came about from unconventional drilling, horizontal drilling, and fracturing, and the development of shale plays. You can see the map up to the top right that outlines all the different shale plays across the U.S. And there's no coincidence. Everywhere you have a geobasin, you probably have some sort of shale play, or you will. And I say or you will because whether or not it's commercial defines the reserves. And as we're seeing today, especially with the global issues with Ukraine, have been heightened. The price of natural gas is going above $10, so you're going to have even some additional plays that are added to that. But in short, the U.S. is one of the cheapest places on the planet right now to make natural gas, so it's no surprise that we're the center of the LNG export universes too. To the left is sort of like that picture about the oil going down the creek and the condensate. That's a flare in the Bakken. And at night, you can even take satellite photos and you can see where all these shale fields are because of the gas that's being flared off. So there's a positive side to natural gas, and that has to do with, to the top left, you'll see a graph that shows all the coal-fired megawatt capacity that's come offline. Now, both natural gas and renewables have both offset those plants that are being retired or being switched over, but natural gas has filled that gap 3-to-1 to the renewables. The one to the bottom highlights, just how much natural gas are we exporting from an LNG standpoint from the U.S. Today, it's around 12 BCF through LNG and another 4 BCF to Mexico and their industries via pipelines, so about 16 BCF. In the next 2 years, that number is probably set to double, which is significant. And that's been both to the positive for the world as well, because the numbers that you're seeing up there from the utility side, the same thing's playing out in the developing nations when they have a choice. Do I build a coal-fired plant, or do I use natural gas and LNG as a cleaner resource in their transition? So when we talk about green LNG, how do you get there? Well, it starts with certified natural gas, and several of my colleagues, and I feel honored today to be up here with them, because I think all of our stories are relevant and interchangeable. But when you start talking about certified natural gas, what is certified natural gas? Well, it just means that you're using the best practices to make sure that you're mitigating your methane emissions. And why is that important? Because when you look at a methane molecule and a CO2 molecule, one methane molecule going to the atmosphere is anywhere from 30 to 70 times more damaging from a greenhouse gas emission than a CO2 molecule. So whether you source your natural gas from a producer that has very strict practices, does not flare, to one that often flares, then those two sources are dramatically different in their carbon input and footprint factor. So it's not just the flaring and reducing of the methane emissions. Another driver on this globally for operators is the investment community itself. This is an excerpt from Forbes magazine that shows that 3,100 investments required some sort of ESG verbiage and commitments from the operators to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions. And that value is worth over $110 trillion. I think this article was out in 2020. So how big is the flaring methane emission problem? These graphs show how it's increased. In large part, this flaring has increased because of the nature of the reservoir itself. Most of your shale wells are what they call retrograde condensate gas wells. It's been organic material deposited in a low energy depositional environment that under certain temperature and time cooks itself. So it has a large associated gas content to those reserves. And you've had operators that in the past, not your tier ones and not even your tier twos, but your tier threes that have gone out, sought investment in the Permian Basin, for example, might have had a 100,000 acre field, and instead of drilling a 5-pad well in the center and putting in the infrastructure to take the gas away, instead drilled 5 wells delineating the reservoir and flaring the gas and selling the oil because the gas was so cheap. And that allowed them to validate the investment, flip it to another operator for a sizable buyout. So this has been what's happened in the past. But now you're starting to see that shift dramatically, both with regulation and the industry itself self-regulating. So one of the biggest sources for methane emission in the U.S. specifically is unscheduled flaring. And that comes about from in the past 5 years, operators typically had a methodology of run equipment until it fails. Don't replace or repair a pump. If the pump goes down in the field, we'll just flare the gas and sell the liquids. Now you're starting to see the industry take notice, and especially around certification around natural gas, having to show that they're not only measuring that they're not doing it, but showing in practice in business operations that they're doing things to mitigate, prevent it through preventative maintenance, predictive analytics, even prescriptive analytics on the maintenance side. So they need systems to do that to help reduce the flaring. They're also investing in other technologies such as vapor recovery units and installing the infrastructure and also the well construction and design to help minimize the flaring, unneeded flaring. Now, I always look at it like there's two elements to this equation. One is measuring things, and Project Astra is a good example of where you got a consortium of stakeholders out in West Texas that have come together. And you have the Pioneer Natural Resources, Exxon, Chevron, and you expect them. But then you go to J.P. Morgan Chase is another one of the key stakeholders in this Project Astra on reducing emissions. And it goes back to that ESG and investing angle of the problem. And then you got the Gastech, GTI, and here's the odd man out. You got the EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, actually being part of the team. Because they know if they don't work with the operators, there's not going to be a functional transition. And then you also got the University of Texas and Texas A&M Lands as part of it. Now together they're developing a virtual digital universe over the Permian and Delaware basins where they're going to use satellites, drones, high frequency sensors. You're going to use all this technology to try to detect and identify where you have flaring occurring and go fix the point sources. But even no matter how good the measurement gets, you're never going to get 100% there. And that's where the human factor comes back into this. And that's where a comprehensive enterprise asset management system comes into play. And with that, it allows you to not only measure what you're emitting as far as methane emissions, but also document and show how are you taking care of these situations? How is your maintenance schedules being run? So now you start to have a digital cornerstone for where you got a system that's both auditable and quasi-immutable. You're never going to have it totally immutable, but if you take the tier one players out in West Texas, like the Shells and Exxons, they're already very mature on the digital data side. But when you go down to the tier twos and tier three players, the order of magnitude, the numbers of those companies go up by the thousands. And they're not very far along. In most of them you'll find they're still operating off of paper and Excel spreadsheets, both of which are not very susceptible or amenable to a blockchain type of strategy. So an enterprise asset management system is the digital cornerstone or first digital step for a lot of these operators. And I'm running over time, so I appreciate it and thank y'all.
Thank you all for, discussing some very important things that we're sort of facing today. I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us when we take a look at where we want to be, and definitely with the net zero sitting behind us, or sitting in front of us, I should say, and always in the back of our minds. There's different behaviors and different things that always come to the surface. And as we went through each one of your presentations, hopefully the audience could tell just how well knitted all of these discussions actually are. And so that's why I'm really excited to be able to have a bit of a discussion here with the team here to sort of talk about some of these things. And definitely through the energy transition and the pressure for social license and to get to net zero, there's a lot of things that are popping up in the conversation today. And some of that leans towards greenwashing, for instance, and that's definitely, you've sort of heard that as a thread through the conversations here, but it becomes a real thing as those pressures face us. And so, as we think about greenwashing and we think about, what we've all discussed on the panel here today, how do some of these things that we're trying to achieve through certification programs and things like that, how does that actually support or how does that allow us to overcome some of those things? And maybe Petra, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Kelly. So I believe when we really can start certifying at least a part of our products we are using throughout our industrial consumption, starting with the green products and really certify them and prove the sustainable origin, we can avoid that the certificates will trade it independently from the goods, for example. And that, from our point of view, from our understanding, really avoids the so-called greenwashing or double counting. And or but, maybe a clear but on the other hand, we know that different regions in the world or different countries follow different regulations. Some of the countries foresee still double counting possibilities for their green certificates, some of them not, for example the EU, but I believe every step in that direction, avoiding double counting the certificates, double or 3 times as you mentioned as well, is the right step in the direction towards the decarbonization in here.
Yeah, absolutely. See, what are some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, as mentioned, it could be double counting. It could be many times counting. And we know that LNG gas is competing, or is between coal or dirtier energy and renewables. And so if you are still maker, right, then you need to register or you need to track all if you make sure you are carbon neutral, you have to make sure everything along your value chain is carbon neutral, including buying LNG. But we also see that, let's say, solar panel, like solar energy, that's clean. But those solar panels were produced in China by burning coal. Mm-hmm. So that value chain is not carbon neutral, it's not clean enough. So when we compare, okay, LNG gas is dirtier than renewables, really, and we need to really think the entire value chain. That's why we want to introduce blockchain to really register and monitor, track every single molecule of the energy we produce.
Yeah, and do we think that these systems of record will actually help continue to send that positive message around LNG as compared to others? And Paul, what do you maybe think about that?
Well, I think the measures that are being taken, the steps that we've heard about, will develop a price to them. There is a price to carbon. Mm-hmm. There's a price to green LNG, but is it a premium? Is it a discount? Is it achieved by preventing an emission? The cost of preventing an emission is probably less than the cost of paying for an emission which has been made. The way in which those commercial influences make their way into the contracts for the buying and selling, to me, I think is one of the difficulties which is ahead. Within a single jurisdiction, and I was struck by Dan's comments, and within the United States, the way in which these things are developing, but push them across different jurisdictions, push them across different political approaches, and the consistency there, I think, is more difficult when you then go to the people doing the deals and looking to make money or save money.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also, Paul, were talking earlier today around the blockchain concept and really the cost of blockchain as well, and looking at the energy consumption to be able to come up with a blockchain perspective. Maybe give me a few of your thoughts and share some of that discussion with the audience here today.
It was in the preparation, and I'm happy to say that I know very little about the tech, but having spent time with cryptocurrencies initially, one of the criticisms of cryptocurrency was the electricity cost of creating the blockchain, and some really startling numbers. Now, if what we're looking at here is that the saviour of verification and the gas industry is blockchain, then in looking at a holistic measure, as I think she was pointing out, yes, solar panels are great once you created them, but creating them creates CO2 emissions. So here you have the blockchain, which may be in a position to create the verification. Well, add that in. What are the emissions that go into making blockchain?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but it struck me as a good question for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, maybe you have some more thoughts on that. And definitely the blockchain allows us to get that transparency that we're looking for. But what are your thoughts?
I think still better than the solar panel by burning coal. Yeah, but I agree. You always create a new problem by by solving another problem. That's I don't think it's avoidable. But I think the current market is quite messy. then we need to think a way to regulate and register, and also really calculate what is in there, and people can put in their credits. It's like a la carte menu. You produce something, then you compensate. Then you have a bank of, let's say, 1,000 certificates in that system. You take one, you take two. Then once you take it, it can't be used the second time.
Yeah,
Then we can probably use solar to produce the power for the blockchain.
absolutely. So Dan, you were talking about, sort of the human error and sort of taking a look at the decarbonization right from when the molecule kind of comes out of the ground. And it, again, feeds into the entire conversation that we've been having here. And as we go through to get that certification process, is it taking a look at it from a snapshot in time or real time? And again, in comes human error as you're working around and working with the maintenance programs. So what are some of your thoughts around how do we get a better picture and a better idea around those things?
Well, that goes to where the companies have to start taking that first step, establishing their digital cornerstone and creating a digital backbone, or like we like to call smart digital reality, that quantifies and tracks how that molecule comes out of the well. Because down the road, whether it's blockchain or whatever mechanism that we're going to certify green LNG, you're not really going to track that molecule all the way to the ship. It's going to be a molecule that comes out of that well, goes into a gathering system, some midstream company that's going to sell a bunch of molecules to the LNG exporter, and it's going to be done on a statistical basis. So for that, and Paul could probably get off into the complexities of doing the contracts for going from from the wellhead down to the boat. But up at the wellhead, it has to start with digitalizing and starting a digital transformation on your operations.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, I don't know, maybe you want to jump in on what Dan was saying.
Yeah, the technology of allocation agreements and attribution agreements is there. They are complex agreements which have sustained the natural gas business. But there you're looking at a very different order of those things, and you're moving away from the contracts as we know them and moving more towards digital inputs, digital measurements, and who knows, maybe fewer lawyers. What did I say?
Yeah, and there is that reality. I mean, it's not a single producer that feeds the LNG market, right? It's usually a collection of producers sending their product down the line to then get us into being able to export into the LNG market, right? So it's not as easy just tracking one producer. There's usually many producers, and see, as you were saying, even if we take a look at all the people that are exporting right now, I can't remember the number, 15 different countries, right? So how do we keep track of all of that? And so I think that goes into the next piece of as we take a look globally with all of the requirements coming from different countries and different programs going in, how can some of these things that we've been talking about today support that? And are they really ready? Are we ready to the point to be able to ensure that we get that certification of our product? Petra, maybe you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. So the very important thing is here that no one or no company alone can prove the sustainability or can prove the greenness, whether it is LNG, whether it is carbon credits, carbon monoxide, or whether it is green products. There has to be a co-development, a co-creation, or a cooperation between the different companies, and every company really, or every partner brings his competency. Is it, for example, Restart, for example, with the knowledge about how blockchain can help overcome the fraud in CO2 trading, for example? Let it be your company with LNG certification, green certification. Let it be the technology or the competence you provide us, or let it be us proving for or building, for example, the highway, so to say, for any certification, and then partnering with certified bodies which are accredited, which are licensed, so to say, to use the governmental approved schemes to certify for the partners in the supply chain, the project supply chain, for example. And I strongly believe that all together we can overcome them and we can verify and the governmental requirements and put them into action.
Yeah, for sure. And Paul, maybe coming back to some of the contracts that you were talking about too, and the impact that, you know, the certification process has on that, for the benefit, for the worse. What are your final thoughts on that?
The transition is across the whole sector, and the transition of contracts. At the moment, all of these gas flows, movements, shipments are underpinned by contracts that exist. Some have existed for decades. They're not well suited to what's moving. They're just not. How they're going to move, how they're going to make their transition is a challenge for the people who are parties to those contracts. And traditionally, people have looked at their positions and whether they're in the money or out of the money, and they've then thought about it. I can't help thinking that there's not going to be time to be doing that, and that it's going to be more a case of looking at your interests, recognising how things have shifted, valuing the relationships that you have under these contracts, and then looking at how to adapt them to make the most of the future, rather than looking at where you came from in another set of circumstances a long time ago.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're at time for today, so I'll stop the questioning there. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us, and thank you all for coming and being here with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.